The earth shook as if the gods themselves had struck it with their fists. Nguyen Van Hai, a Vietcong fighter hiding in an underground tunnel near the Cambodian border, would later recall that moment as the day the sky disappeared. It was December 1972, and the American B-52 Stratofortress bombers were unleashing what would become known as the most concentrated aerial bombardment in human history. The jungle canopy, once a protector, was now transformed into deadly shrapnel as bombs fell in patterns so dense that Vietcong fighters described it as steel rain. From 30,000 feet above, the American flight crews could not see the devastation they unleashed. They simply received coordinates, opened bomb bay doors, and watched as their payloads disappeared into the clouds below. For those on the ground, however, the experience was apocalyptic, a man-made thunderstorm that turned night into day and silence into chaos. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The concept of aerial bombing had evolved dramatically since its first limited use in World War I. By the time the United States found itself deeply entrenched in the Vietnam conflict, the strategic bomber had transformed from a rudimentary platform into a sophisticated instrument of war policy. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, initially designed during the Cold War as a nuclear deterrent against the Soviet Union, would find an unexpected role in the jungles of Southeast Asia. This 8-engine behemoth, with its 185-foot wingspan and ability to carry up to 70,000 pounds of conventional ordnance, became the ultimate expression of American air power and the embodiment of terror for those fighting below. The roots of the air campaign against North Vietnam and Vietcong positions in the South stretched back to the early 1960s, when American military advisors first arrived in South Vietnam. As the conflict intensified following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson authorized the first sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder. Beginning on March 2, 1965, this operation would continue for more than 3 years, dropping over 864,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnamese targets. Yet Rolling Thunder, despite its intensity, was just the prelude to what would come later. Within the Pentagon and White House, a fundamental strategic debate raged. Some military leaders, particularly Air Force Generals Curtis LeMay and John D. Ryan, advocated for overwhelming force, unrestricted bombing that would bring North Vietnam to its knees. Others, including Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, favored a more graduated approach using air power as a calibrated instrument to communicate American resolve. This tension between competing philosophies would shape the air war throughout the conflict, creating a pattern of escalation, pauses, and renewed intensity that reflected the political complexities in Washington as much as the military situation in Vietnam. The first B-52 bombing mission in Vietnam occurred on June 18, 1965, when 30 bombers took off from Andersen Air Force Base in Guam to strike Viet Cong positions in a suspected stronghold near Ben Cat, a small town north of Saigon. The mission, codenamed Arc Light, marked the debut of Strategic Air Command's premier bomber in a conventional conflict. Captain James Gehrig, a B-52 pilot who flew one of the first missions, later recalled, "We were trained for nuclear war against the Soviets. Suddenly we're dropping conventional bombs on a jungle. It was surreal, like using a sledgehammer to kill a fly." Yet that sledgehammer would soon become a central component of American strategy. The B-52s operated primarily from 2 locations, Andersen Air Force Base in Guam and Utapao Royal Thai Navy Airfield in Thailand. The flights from Guam, over 2,500 miles from Vietnam, required multiple aerial refuelings and missions that often exceeded 12 hours of flight time. Crews would take off from the Pacific Island, rendezvous with KC-135 Stratotanker aerial refueling aircraft, proceed to their targets in Vietnam, deliver their payloads, and then make the long journey home. From U Tapao, the missions were shorter but no less intense. This operational tempo placed enormous strain on both aircraft and crews, who found themselves engaged in a form of aerial warfare unlike anything for which they had trained. The bombers typically flew in 3 aircraft cells, maintaining precise distances from each other to ensure optimal dispersal of their bomb patterns. Inside each aircraft, the 6-man crew, aircraft commander, pilot, radar navigator, electronic warfare officer, and gunner worked in a tightly choreographed routine perfected through endless hours of training. The radar navigator held particular responsibility, as it was his calculations that determined when the bombs would be released. Given that targets were often obscured by cloud cover or jungle canopy, the crew relied entirely on radar systems and pre-mission coordinates to deliver their payloads. Each B-52 could carry up to 108 500-pound bombs internally, creating a destructive footprint approximately 1 mile long and half a mile wide. When multiple aircraft dropped their bombs in sequence, they could effectively carpet an area with explosives, leaving nothing untouched within the target zone. This saturation bombing tactic was designed to destroy not just physical targets, but also the morale of enemy forces, who had no warning of the impending attack and no effective defense against it. On the ground, Vietcong and North Vietnamese Army NVA forces developed their own response to the B-52 threat. An elaborate system of tunnels and underground shelters provided some protection against the bombing, though a direct hit, or near miss, could collapse these structures, burying those inside alive. Units dispersed widely, avoiding concentrations that might attract American attention. A sophisticated warning network, relying on spotters near American bases and along likely flight paths, sometimes provided precious minutes of advance notice before an attack. Yet even with these measures, the psychological impact of B-52 strikes remained profound. Lê Quan, a former NVA soldier who survived multiple bombing raids, described the experience in a 1998 interview. First, you hear nothing. The planes are too high. Then suddenly the earth itself becomes alive, shaking, jumping, throwing you against the walls of your shelter. The sound comes after the first impacts, not like thunder, something much worse. Your eardrums feel like they will burst. Your lungs cannot get air. And it continues, wave after wave, until you think the world is ending. Many men broke under this. Their minds could not accept such violence. The air war escalated dramatically after the 1968 Tet Offensive. Although the coordinated attacks by Vietcong and NVA forces were ultimately repelled with heavy losses, the psychological impact on American public opinion was profound. The Johnson administration, already facing growing anti-war sentiment, announced a partial bombing halt north of the 20th parallel on March 31, 1968, and complete cessation of bombing North Vietnam on November 1, 1968. However, this did not end B-52 operations, which continued against targets in South Vietnam, Laos, and eventually Cambodia. The secret bombing of Cambodia, authorized by President Richard Nixon in 1969 under the codename Operation Menu, represented a significant expansion of the air war, targeting sanctuaries used by North Vietnamese forces along the border. These missions were conducted under extraordinary secrecy, with crews often unaware of their actual targets and bombing records falsified to hide the true nature of the operations. Between March 1969 and May 1970, more than 3,600 B-52 sorties dropped over 110,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia, a neutral country, creating controversy that would eventually contribute to congressional limitations on presidential war powers. Within the Air Force, the B-52 campaign was viewed as the most effective application of American air power. General William Maumier, commander of the 7th Air Force from 1966 to 1968, stated in his official report that B-52 strikes produced the highest number of enemy casualties per mission and inflicted the greatest psychological damage. Intelligence. Estimates suggested that a single B-52 raid could neutralize up to 50% of enemy forces in a target area through casualties, destruction of supplies, and psychological impact. Yet these claims were difficult to verify, as bomb damage assessment was often limited to aerial photography that could not accurately measure enemy casualties or disruption of operations beneath the jungle canopy. The human experience aboard the B-52s themselves offered a stark contrast to the devastation they created. Flying at altitudes over 30,000 feet, crews were physically and emotionally detached from the consequences of their actions. The sterile environment of the aircraft, with its instrument panels, oxygen masks, and pressure suits, created a sense of abstraction. Targets appeared only as radar blips or map coordinates. After releasing their bombs, crews would often feel a slight upward surge as the aircraft, suddenly lighter, gained altitude. But they never witnessed the actual explosions or aftermath. Lieutenant Colonel James McCarthy, who flew over 70 B-52 missions during the war, later reflected on this disconnect. There's something surreal about dropping that much explosive power and never seeing what happens. You deliver your payload, make your turn, and head back to base. Later, you might see reconnaissance photos, but it's all abstract. Craters in the jungle, damaged structures. The human toll remains invisible. I think that made it possible for many of us to compartmentalize what we were doing. This psychological distance was reinforced by the technical language and procedures that dominated B-52 operations. Missions were described in clinical terms: target servicing, ordnance delivery, pattern coverage. Effectiveness was measured in percentage of targets destroyed, not lives taken. This technical framing helped crews maintain their focus on the professional execution of their duties, though many would later struggle with the moral implications of their role in the war. For some crew members, the contradiction between their actions and the limited visible results created a form of cognitive dissonance. Captain Michael Heck, a B-52 electronic warfare officer who flew missions from 1969 to 1970, recalled, "We dropped these massive bomb loads, then returned to Guam where you could go to the beach or have a beer at the officers' club." The war seemed almost theoretical until we'd hear about a crew getting shot down. Then it became very real, very fast. But the people under our bombs? They remained statistics, not individuals. The North Vietnamese, however, were not passive recipients of American air power. As the war progressed, they developed one of the most sophisticated integrated air defense systems outside the Soviet bloc. Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, particularly the SA-2 guideline, posed a deadly threat to American aircraft. By 1972, North Vietnam had more than 200 SAM sites concentrated around Hanoi and Haiphong, complemented by thousands of anti-aircraft artillery pieces and MiG interceptor aircraft. B-52s, with their large radar cross-section and relatively limited maneuverability, were particularly vulnerable to these defenses when operating at lower altitudes or over heavily defended areas. Initial B-52 operations had avoided these heavily defended regions, focusing instead on targets in South Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos, where air defenses were minimal. This changed dramatically in 1972 when the Nixon administration, responding to North Vietnam's Easter offensive, authorized renewed bombing of North Vietnam, including the previously restricted areas around Hanoi and Haiphong. Operation Linebacker, which began in May 1972, marked a significant escalation in the air campaign and brought B-52s into direct confrontation with North Vietnam's most formidable defenses. The Easter Offensive, launched by North Vietnam on March 30, 1972, was their largest conventional attack of the war. With most American ground troops already withdrawn under Nixon's Vietnamization policy, the offensive relied on South Vietnamese forces to bear the brunt of the defense, supported by American air power. The scale of the North Vietnamese attack, involving 14 divisions and over 120,000 troops, shocked American planners and threatened to collapse South Vietnamese resistance. President Nixon, determined not to see South Vietnam fall during an election year, ordered an immediate and massive air response, On April 6, 1972, B-52s struck targets in the North Vietnamese Panhandle for the first time since 1968. Over the following weeks, as Operation Linebacker developed into a sustained campaign, strikes moved progressively northward. By October 1972, with peace negotiations stalled in Paris, Nixon authorized B-52 strikes within the 10-mile radius around Hanoi that had previously been off-limits. These missions encountered fierce resistance, with North Vietnamese forces launching salvos of SAMs at the incoming bombers. Despite sophisticated electronic countermeasures and support from specialized Wild Weasel aircraft designed to suppress enemy air defenses, B-52 crews faced a deadly gauntlet. The intensity of North Vietnamese air defenses was described by Major Charles Clements, whose B-52 was damaged by a SAM during an October mission. The sky lit up with these telephone pole-sized missiles coming up at us. Our electronic warfare officer was calling out radar locks and missile launches so fast he could barely keep up. We took a hit that tore through our right wing, but somehow we managed to limp back to Thailand. When we landed, I counted over 40 holes in our aircraft. It was a miracle we made it back. Not all crews were so fortunate. Between the beginning of Linebacker and December 1972, 7 B-52s were lost to enemy action, with several more damaged. Despite these losses, American military leaders pressed for even greater escalation. After peace talks broke down again in December 1972, Nixon authorized Operation Linebacker II, an 11-day campaign of maximum intensity bombing directed primarily at the Hanoi-Haiphong area. Beginning on December 18th, this operation, which would become known as the Christmas bombing, represented the most concentrated use of B-52s in the entire war. Over 700 B-52 sorties dropped more than 15,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnamese targets between December 18th and December 29, 1972, unlike earlier operations, which typically involved smaller formations attacking targets throughout the day and night. Linebacker II employed mass formations of B-52s in coordinated waves against multiple targets. On the first night alone, 129 B-52s participated in 3 massive strikes, separated by several hours. The scale and intensity of the attack overwhelmed North Vietnamese air defenses, though not without cost. On that first night, 3 B-52s were shot down, with more damaged, the highest single-day loss rate of the bomber during the entire war. The North Vietnamese defenders responded with extraordinary effort, firing nearly 1,000 SAMs during the 11-day campaign. Their tactics evolved rapidly as they observed patterns in American operations and adjusted their launch procedures to maximize effectiveness. Despite flying repeatedly into this intense defensive environment, B-52 crews maintained remarkable discipline. Captain William Stocker, a radar navigator who flew 4 missions during Linebacker II, recalled, "We knew the odds were against us making it through multiple missions unscathed. But you compartmentalize that fear. You focus on the technical aspects, maintaining precise position in the formation, ensuring accurate timing for bomb release, monitoring enemy radar signals. Your training takes over, and somehow you push the fear into the background." For the North Vietnamese population, particularly in Hanoi and Haiphong, Linebacker II created an unprecedented ordeal. Although American planners had selected primarily military and infrastructure targets, power plants, rail yards, air defense sites, petroleum storage facilities, the concentrated nature of urban areas, and the massive explosive power of B-52 strikes inevitably resulted in civilian casualties. North Vietnamese sources claimed that nearly 1,600 civilians were killed in Hanoi alone, though American officials disputed these figures, suggesting they were exaggerated for propaganda purposes. Bach Mai Hospital, Hanoi's largest medical facility, was damaged on December 22nd when bombs intended for a nearby military installation went astray. Several dozen patients and staff were killed, creating an international outcry and reinforcing North Vietnamese propaganda about American terror bombing. The controversy surrounding civilian casualties placed additional pressure on the Nixon administration to bring the campaign to a swift conclusion. Within the American bomber force, losses mounted as the operation continued. By December 22nd, after 5 days of intensive bombing, 15 B-52s had been shot down or damaged beyond repair, with dozens more suffering combat damage. The loss of 90 aircrew members, killed, captured, or missing, represented a significant blow to the elite bomber force. Air Force commanders responded by adjusting tactics, varying approach routes, altitudes, and timing to make aircraft less predictable to North Vietnamese defenders. These changes, coupled with the progressive degradation of North Vietnamese air defense capabilities under sustained attack, reduced losses in the campaign's final days. The tempo of Linebacker II created enormous strain on both aircraft and personnel. B-52 maintenance crews worked around the clock in Guam and Thailand, preparing aircraft for repeated missions with minimal turnaround time. Pilots and navigators often flew multiple high-stress combat missions with little rest in between. Despite these challenges, mission execution remained remarkably precise, with most bombs falling within intended target areas, a testament to the professionalism and training of Strategic Air Command's personnel. The operation reached its zenith on December 26th, when 120 B-52s struck targets throughout the Hanoi-Haiphong area in coordinated waves. That night, North Vietnamese air defenses fired their last significant salvos of SAMs, having nearly exhausted their supply of missiles after days of intensive operations. 2 more B-52s were lost, bringing the total for the campaign to 15 aircraft destroyed. The human cost was also significant. 43 American airmen were killed, 49 were taken prisoner, and 15 were rescued after their aircraft went down. On December 29, 1972, President Nixon halted the bombing of targets north of the 20th parallel, bringing Linebacker II to a conclusion. 4 days later, on January 2, 1973, North Vietnamese officials agreed to resume peace negotiations in Paris. On January 15th, Nixon announced a complete halt to all bombing, mining, and artillery fire against North Vietnam. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973, officially ending direct American involvement in the Vietnam War, though the conflict between North and South Vietnam would continue for 2 more years. The debate over Linebacker II's effectiveness and morality began immediately and continues to this day. American military leaders, particularly in the Air Force, hailed the operation as the decisive action that finally brought North Vietnam to the negotiating table. General John W. Volk, Jr., commander of the 7th Air Force during Linebacker II, stated, "They were on the ropes because of the pounding they were taking. I had no doubt in my mind that they wanted to quit. And the B-52s were the deciding factor." This view was echoed by Nixon himself, who wrote in his memoirs that the Christmas bombing had broken the deadlock in the negotiations. North Vietnamese officials, however, offered a different perspective. Foreign Minister Nguyen Co Thach later claimed that the decision to return to negotiations had been made before Linebacker II began, and the bombing actually hardened their resolve. In a 1983 interview, he stated, "We had already decided to sign the agreement as it stood in October. The American Christmas bombing was entirely unnecessary. It killed many people, but changed nothing in the final agreement. It was perhaps for your President Nixon to show he was strong, but not for any military necessity." The impact on the ground for Vietnamese civilians and Vietcong fighters created lasting psychological wounds that would shape their perception of America for generations. Nguyen Thi Hoa, who lived in the outskirts of Hanoi during the bombing, described the experience in terms that transcended politics. "When the B-52s came, there was no politics anymore, just survival. The entire earth became your enemy. We would run to the shelters hearing only one prayer in our minds: let it end, let it end. For years afterward, thunder would make me throw myself to the ground." How can you forget such terror? Meanwhile, in the skies above Vietnam, American aircrews faced their own psychological battles. The disconnect between the abstract nature of their missions, dropping bombs on radar targets they never saw, and the growing awareness of the destruction they caused created moral complexity that many would struggle with for decades. Technical competence provided some psychological shelter, allowing crews to focus on the professional execution of their duties rather than their consequences. Yet, as Captain Robert Certain, a B-52 navigator shot down during Linebacker 2 who spent time as a POW, later noted, "We were professionals doing our job, but that doesn't mean we were unaware of what that job meant. You can't drop that kind of destructive power and not think about it." As 1972 drew to a close and Operation Linebacker 2 reached its devastating climax, the full impact of America's B-52 campaign was still being assessed. What was clear, however, was that the relationship between technology, morality, and strategic effectiveness had reached a new level of complexity. The massive bombers circling high above, Southeast Asia had demonstrated both the awesome destructive potential of American air power and its ultimate limitations in resolving a conflict deeply rooted in political, social, and historical forces that no amount of explosive force could fully address. The final judgment on this aerial campaign would depend not just on its immediate military results, but on how it would be remembered by those who experienced it from both above and below. North Vietnamese Army Colonel Bui Tin, who would later accept the surrender of South Vietnam in 1975, recalled his experience during the Linebacker 2 campaign with remarkable clarity. The B-52s came in 3 waves, and the earth trembled. Entire regiments disappeared in seconds. We recovered bodies 100 meters from where they had been during the explosions, thrown through the air by the blast wave. As dawn broke over Hanoi on December 30th, 1972, the smoke still rising from multiple impact zones across the city, North Vietnamese leaders gathered to assess the situation. Their air defense network had fired over 1,200 surface-to-air missiles during 11 days of combat, downing 15 B-52s and damaging dozens more. Yet their missile stocks were nearly depleted, key infrastructure lay in ruins, and the capacity to sustain defense against continuing bombardment was increasingly questionable. The decision to return to the Paris peace talks was made not in a vacuum, but against this backdrop of unprecedented aerial destruction. The aftermath of Operation Linebacker 2 produced immediate physical consequences across North Vietnam. The most visible impact was on transportation infrastructure, with every major railroad line severed at multiple points. All bridges connecting Hanoi to surrounding provinces were damaged or destroyed. Power generation capacity was reduced by approximately 80%, plunging large areas into darkness. Petroleum storage facilities containing much of North Vietnam's strategic reserves were set ablaze, creating towering columns of smoke visible for miles. The port of Haiphong, through which most Soviet and Chinese military aid flowed, was rendered temporarily inoperable by precision strikes and naval mining operations. Military installations throughout the Hanoi-Haiphong region suffered significant damage. The North Vietnamese Air Force, which had played only a limited role in opposing Linebacker 2, lost numerous aircraft on the ground when their protective revetments were penetrated by 2,000-pound bombs. Air Defense Command and Control Centers, systematically targeted throughout the campaign, struggled to coordinate the remaining SAM batteries and anti-aircraft artillery units. The logistical network supporting North Vietnamese forces in the south was severely disrupted, with ammunition and supply depots destroyed and transportation routes severed. For ordinary Vietnamese civilians, the consequences were profound. Thousands were displaced from damaged homes in Hanoi and Haiphong, creating a refugee crisis in the midst of winter. Medical facilities, already strained by years of conflict, were overwhelmed with casualties. The damage to electrical and water infrastructure created immediate public health challenges, with water purification systems inoperable and hospitals relying on emergency generators. Food distribution networks, dependent on the same transportation infrastructure that had been targeted, experienced significant disruption, leading to temporary shortages in urban areas. North Vietnamese authorities responded with remarkable organizational efficiency, mobilizing civil defense units to clear rubble, repair essential services, and provide emergency assistance to affected populations. The societal resilience that had sustained North Vietnam through years of bombing was again demonstrated as communities worked collectively to address immediate needs. Yet the scale of destruction from the B-52 campaign created challenges unlike any previously experienced. Le Duc Tho, North Vietnam's chief negotiator in Paris, later acknowledged, "The Christmas bombing created serious difficulties for us. We had endured much bombing before, but not of this intensity, not with these weapons." While North Vietnam coped with the physical aftermath of Linebacker II, American B-52 crews and support personnel were processing their own experiences. The operational tempo of the campaign had been extraordinary, with some crews flying multiple combat missions within days or even hours. The loss of 15 aircraft and their crews had created a palpable sense of vulnerability within a force accustomed to operating with near impunity. Master Sergeant Thomas Kelly, a crew chief at Utapao Air Base in Thailand, described the atmosphere. "When the first crews didn't come back, it hit everyone hard. These were guys you'd had breakfast with that morning." The officers tried to maintain the professional facade, but you could see it in their eyes, that realization that the next mission could be their last. For surviving crew members, the return to normal operations brought a complex mix of emotions. Relief at their own survival was tempered by grief for lost comrades, and for some, growing questions about the campaign they had participated in. Captain Brandon Miller, a B-52 pilot who flew 6 missions during Linebacker II, recalled, "We were trained to compartmentalize, to focus on the mission, and block out everything else. But after it was over, when the adrenaline faded, you started thinking about what we'd just done. The tonnage we'd dropped, the targets we'd hit. Some guys never questioned it. It was the job, and we did it well. Others struggled more, especially as the debate about the bombing heated up back home. That debate was indeed intensifying. Initial reports of the bombing campaign generated significant domestic and international criticism. Democratic Senator Edward Kennedy described Linebacker II as a ruthless exercise in mass terror, while the governments of Sweden, France, and other nations issued formal protests. Media coverage in the United States and internationally featured images of civilian casualties and damaged non-military structures, particularly Bach Mai Hospital. Air Force and Nixon administration officials countered with their own narrative, emphasizing the precision of the bombing, the primarily military nature of the targets, and the strategic necessity of the operation to break the diplomatic stalemate. Within military circles, however, Linebacker II was widely viewed as a validation of strategic air power doctrine. Air Force analysts pointed to the North Vietnamese return to negotiations as evidence that properly applied air power could achieve results that years of limited bombing and ground operations had failed to secure. General John C. Meyer, Commander-in-Chief of Strategic Air Command, stated in his after-action report, "Linebacker II demonstrated conclusively that strategic air power, employed with precision against carefully selected targets, can have decisive impact on an enemy's willingness and ability to continue hostilities." This assessment would influence Air Force doctrine and planning for decades to come. The tactical and operational lessons of the campaign were studied intensively. The loss rate of approximately 2% of sorties, while low by historical standards for such intensive operations in heavily defended airspace, led to significant revisions in B-52 tactics, electronic countermeasures, and formation procedures. The effectiveness of North Vietnamese air defenses, particularly their ability to adapt quickly to changing American tactics, provided valuable insights into the capabilities of Soviet-designed integrated air defense systems. These lessons would inform the development of stealth technology, precision-guided munitions, and advanced electronic warfare systems in subsequent decades. For North Vietnamese military leaders, Linebacker II offered its own lessons. The vulnerability of fixed installations to precision attack accelerated their emphasis on mobility and dispersal. The experience reinforced their understanding of the importance of air defense depth and redundancy. Perhaps most significantly, it highlighted the value of their strategy of protracted conflict, accepting tactical and operational setbacks while maintaining strategic focus on their ultimate political objectives. Despite the devastation of Linebacker II, North Vietnamese resolve remained unbroken, a fact that would prove crucial in the final phases of the war. The Paris Peace Accord, signed on January 27, 1973, represented a diplomatic conclusion to direct American involvement in Vietnam, but not an end to the underlying conflict. The agreement provided for the withdrawal of all remaining American forces, the return of American prisoners of war, a ceasefire between North and South Vietnamese forces, and the establishment of a framework for eventual political reconciliation. It did not, however, require North Vietnamese forces to withdraw from territory they occupied in South Vietnam, nor did it resolve the fundamental question of Vietnam's political future. For American B-52 crews, the signing of the accords brought a significant reduction in operational tempo, though not an immediate end to their involvement in Southeast Asia. B-52 operations continued in Laos until the signing of a separate ceasefire agreement for that country in February 1973, and in Cambodia until August 1973, when congressional action finally terminated all American bombing in Indochina, the withdrawal of the bomber force to Guam, and eventually back to bases in the continental United States marked the end of an 8-year deployment that had fundamentally transformed both the aircraft and the organizations that operated them. The human cost of the B-52 campaign remains difficult to quantify precisely. North Vietnamese sources claim that approximately 1,600 civilians were killed during Linebacker II alone, though these figures have been disputed by American officials. The total casualties from all B-52 operations throughout the war, including those in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, likely number in the tens of thousands, with an uncountable toll of wounded and displaced. For the American bomber force, 134 aircrew members were killed in action or listed as missing, with 33 aircraft lost to enemy action and dozens more to operational accidents. Beyond these numerical assessments lies a more complex human story, that of individuals on both sides, whose lives were profoundly altered by their experiences. For many American aircrew members, the Vietnam Air War represented a challenging reconciliation of professional duty with moral complexity. Lieutenant James Merrick, a B-52 navigator who flew 102 combat missions between 1968 and 1971, reflected, "We were executing national policy implemented through the military chain of command. Most of us believed we were serving our country honorably. Yet as the years passed, as the war's controversial nature became more apparent, many of us had to re-examine our roles. Not with regret or apology, we did our duty as we understood it, but with a more nuanced appreciation of the moral complexity of warfare. For Vietnamese who experienced the bombing, the legacy was often more visceral. Tran Thi Huan, who lost her parents and 2 siblings during a B-52 strike near Haiphong in 1972, expressed a perspective shared by many survivors. The Americans speak of this as a war, but for us, it was simply survival. The planes came from somewhere we could not see, dropped their bombs, and disappeared. We did not see the faces of those who killed our families. Perhaps that made it easier for them, but it made it harder for us to understand. Even now, decades later, when I hear certain sounds, a distant thunder, a heavy truck on the road, I am a child again, running for shelter. The psychological impact on B-52 crews varied widely. Some maintained that their role, while difficult, had been necessary and justified by the broader context of Cold War containment policy. Others struggled with post-traumatic stress, moral injury, or growing doubts about the wisdom and justice of the campaign they had participated in. Captain Michael Lanning, who flew 51 B-52 missions and later became a psychologist specializing in combat trauma, observed, "The unique aspect of bomber operations is the combination of extreme danger with extreme detachment. You risk your life flying through intense anti-aircraft fire, yet never see the human consequences of your actions. That creates a particular kind of psychological stress that many crew members didn't fully process until years or even decades later. The B-52 campaign also had lasting effects on the physical landscape of Vietnam. Unexploded ordnance from bombing operations continues to pose risks to civilian populations, particularly in rural areas where bombs fell on less populated regions. Environmental impacts, including the creation of approximately 26 million craters throughout the country, altered drainage patterns, destroyed forest cover, and displaced wildlife. The most heavily bombed areas required decades to recover ecologically, with some regions still showing visible evidence of the bombing campaign from satellite imagery today. The strategic debate over the effectiveness and necessity of the B-52 campaign continues among historians and military analysts. Proponents argue that Linebacker II demonstrated the decisive potential of strategic air power when employed with sufficient intensity and focus on critical targets. They point to the chronological proximity between the bombing campaign and North Vietnam's return to serious negotiations as evidence of cause and effect. Critics counter that the final peace agreement differed little from terms available before the bombing began, suggesting that the campaign's military effectiveness did not translate into significant diplomatic leverage. This debate reflects broader questions about the relationship between military means and political ends that have relevance beyond the specific context of Vietnam. The B-52 campaign represented the application of America's most powerful conventional military capability, yet its ultimate contribution to achieving American political objectives remains contested. This disconnect between tactical success and strategic outcome has informed subsequent American military doctrine, particularly regarding the integration of military operations with diplomatic initiatives and the importance of clearly defined, achievable political objectives. For the Vietnamese people, the legacy of the B-52 campaign exists within the broader context of a conflict that spanned 3 decades and claimed millions of lives. The American War, as it is known in Vietnam, represents just one chapter in a longer struggle for national independence and unification that included conflicts with French colonial forces and, after American withdrawal, continued fighting between North and South Vietnamese forces until Saigon's fall in April 1975. Within this historical narrative, the B-52 bombing campaigns are remembered as the most technologically advanced phase of foreign intervention, but not as the defining experience of the war. The physical remnants of the air campaign have been incorporated into Vietnam's commemorative landscape. In Hanoi, the B-52 Victory Museum displays wreckage from downed bombers alongside captured equipment and photographs documenting the air defense effort. At Hue Thiep Lake in the city's Ba Dinh district, the partially submerged remains of a B-52 shot down during Linebacker II have been preserved as a memorial. These sites serve both commemorative and educational purposes, presenting the Vietnamese perspective on a conflict that is remembered very differently in American historical consciousness. For American air crews, particularly those who participated in Linebacker II, recognition of their service came slowly. The controversial nature of the Vietnam War meant that returning military personnel often faced public indifference or hostility rather than the celebration accorded to veterans of earlier conflicts. It was not until 1985 that the Air Force formally recognized Linebacker II participants with the award of the Vietnam Service Medal with special Linebacker II Feist clasp, acknowledging what many Air Force leaders described as the most challenging conventional bombing campaign in the service's history. The technological legacy of the B-52 campaign proved substantial. The vulnerabilities revealed during operations over North Vietnam accelerated development of electronic countermeasures, precision-guided munitions, and stealth technology. The success of North Vietnamese air defenses in downing even high-altitude strategic bombers demonstrated the growing sophistication of integrated air defense systems and the need for new approaches to penetrating defended airspace. These lessons influenced military procurement and doctrine for decades, culminating in systems like the F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighter, which would later demonstrate the evolution of air warfare during the 1991 Gulf War. The B-52 itself underwent significant modifications based on Vietnam experience. The G and H models incorporated improved electronic warfare systems, structural reinforcements, and enhanced defensive capabilities. Far from being rendered obsolete by the challenges encountered over Vietnam, the B-52 platform demonstrated remarkable adaptability. These aircraft would continue serving through the Cold War, the Gulf War, and into the 21st century, with B-52H models projected to remain in service until the 2050s, nearly a century after the type's introduction. For North Vietnam, the aftermath of the Christmas bombing campaign presented both challenges and opportunities. The physical destruction required massive reconstruction efforts, particularly for transportation infrastructure and industrial facilities. Soviet and Chinese aid, which had sustained North Vietnam throughout the conflict, increased following the Paris Peace Accords, providing critical resources for recovery. The experience of withstanding the most intensive bombing campaign of the war reinforced North Vietnamese confidence in their ultimate victory, despite the temporary setbacks inflicted by American air power. The ceasefire established by the Paris Peace Accords proved short-lived. By March 1973, violations were occurring regularly on both sides. North Vietnamese forces, rather than withdrawing, consolidated their positions in South Vietnam and continued building the logistical infrastructure needed for future operations. American military aid to South Vietnam continued, but at significantly reduced levels compared to the period of direct U.S. involvement. Without American combat forces to support them, South Vietnamese military capabilities gradually eroded. When North Vietnam launched its final offensive in early 1975, South Vietnamese resistance collapsed more rapidly than most observers had anticipated. On April 30, 1975, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces, bringing the Vietnam War to its ultimate conclusion. The rapid South Vietnamese defeat raised additional questions about the strategic impact of the B-52 campaign and other American military operations. Despite the immense destructive power brought to bear against North Vietnam, its will and capacity to continue the conflict had not been decisively broken. This outcome prompted significant reassessment within American military circles. The Vietnam experience challenged many assumptions about the relationship between technological superiority and strategic success. Colonel Harry Summers, in his influential analysis on Strategy, a Critical Analysis of the Vietnam War, observed, "The irony of Vietnam is that we won every major battle, including the air campaign, yet lost the war." This suggests a fundamental disconnection between tactical success and strategic outcome that requires serious examination. This examination would influence American military thinking in subsequent decades, particularly regarding the integration of military operations with broader political strategies. The human dimensions of the bombing campaign continued to evolve long after the war's conclusion. For Vietnamese survivors, physical rebuilding was accompanied by psychological recovery from trauma that, in many cases, lasted lifetimes. Nguyen Van Thuyen, who survived multiple B-52 strikes as a teenager in the Red River Delta, described this process. "For years after the war, I could not sleep through the night. Every sound might be a bomber. Every thunderstorm brought back memories. It was only when my own children were born that I began to focus more on the future than the past." But even now, 50 years later, certain sounds can bring it all back in an instant. American veterans of the air campaign experienced their own complex psychological aftermath. Some found their service unproblematic, viewing it as a necessary response to North Vietnamese aggression and the fulfillment of their professional duties. Others developed more nuanced or critical perspectives as the broader context of the war became clearer over time. A significant number experienced post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly those who had been shot down and captured or had witnessed the deaths of fellow crew members. Captain James Werner, a B-52 pilot who flew in both Rolling Thunder and linebacker operations, reflected on this evolution. When you're young and in the middle of it, you don't question much. You have a mission, you execute it professionally. It's later, when you have time to think, that the complexity emerges. I don't regret serving. We did what our country asked of us. But I've come to see the war differently than I did then. The certainties of youth give way to the ambiguities of experience. The historiography of the B-52 campaign reflects this complexity. Early accounts, particularly those from military sources, tended to emphasize the technical achievements and tactical effectiveness of the bombing operations. The official Air Force history characterized the linebacker the Sim as the decisive factor in bringing North Vietnam back to the negotiating table, a view that dominated military analysis through the 1970s. Civilian historians, drawing on a broader range of sources, including Vietnamese perspectives, often presented more skeptical assessments of the campaign's strategic effectiveness and raised more pointed questions about its human cost. As Vietnamese archives gradually opened to Western researchers in the 1990s and 2000s, new perspectives emerged. North Vietnamese military records revealed both the devastating impact of B-52 strikes and the remarkable resilience of their forces in adapting to and countering American air operations. Oral histories collected from Vietnamese survivors provided powerful testimony about the civilian experience of the bombing, adding important dimensions to the historical record. These sources have enabled more comprehensive assessments that acknowledge both the technical sophistication of the American air campaign and its ultimate limitations in achieving strategic objectives. The relationship between the United States and Vietnam has undergone remarkable transformation in the decades since the war. Diplomatic relations, severed with the fall of Saigon, were formally restored in 1995. Economic ties have grown steadily, with the United States now among Vietnam's largest trading partners. Military cooperation has developed as well, reflecting shared concerns about regional security dynamics, particularly regarding China's growing influence in Southeast Asia. This evolving relationship has created space for more nuanced engagement with the war's legacy, including the B-52 campaign by participants and historians from both nations. Joint historical projects bringing together American and Vietnamese scholars have produced more comprehensive understandings of the air war. Technical details from American military archives can now be integrated with Vietnamese accounts of the bombing's impact, creating fuller historical narratives. Veterans from both sides have participated in reconciliation initiatives, sometimes returning to the sites of their wartime service to meet former adversaries. These encounters often reveal unexpected commonalities, professional respect between former enemies, shared traumatic experiences, and mutual recognition of the human dimensions of conflict that transcend ideological differences. Former B-52 navigator William Preston described such an encounter at a 2010 conference in Hanoi. I met General Nguyen Van Viet, who had commanded air defenses during Linebacker II. We compared notes on specific missions, dates, times, targets. His memory was remarkable, and so was his lack of animosity. At one point he said, "We were both soldiers doing our duty. Now we are old men who can be friends." That moment taught me more about reconciliation than any book could. The physical legacy of the bombing remains visible in Vietnam's landscape, though increasingly overlaid by decades of subsequent development. Crater fields have been transformed into agricultural land or absorbed by expanding urban areas. The scrap metal industry that developed to salvage downed aircraft and unexploded ordnance has evolved into legitimate recycling enterprises. Yet unexploded bombs continue to be discovered regularly, particularly in rural areas, where agricultural and construction activities unearth munitions that failed to detonate during the war. Efforts to address this dangerous legacy have become another avenue for cooperation between former enemies. American technical assistance and funding support Vietnamese-led unexploded ordnance clearance programs, particularly in heavily bombed regions, along the former demilitarized zone. These programs not only reduce physical danger to current populations, but also serve as tangible demonstrations of American acknowledgement of the war's continuing impact on Vietnam. The B-52 itself has undergone remarkable transformation in its symbolic meaning. Once the embodiment of American military might and technological superiority, then a controversial symbol of what critics called overkill in an asymmetric conflict, the aircraft has evolved into something more complex in collective memory. For military aviation enthusiasts, it represents extraordinary engineering achievement and longevity. For historians, it embodies the paradoxes of Vietnam, awesome tactical capability that nonetheless failed to secure strategic victory. For many Vietnamese, particularly younger generations, it has become an abstraction, a historical artifact rather than a lived experience, understood primarily through museum displays and commemorative sites. This evolution of meaning reflects broader patterns in how societies process and integrate traumatic historical experiences. What was once immediate and overwhelming gradually becomes contextualized within larger historical narratives. Personal experiences, with their intense emotional content, give way to more collective and institutionalized forms of remembrance. The passing of generations transforms lived memory into historical knowledge, changing how events are understood and commemorated. Yet for those who directly experienced the bombing, whether as crew members or as targets, the sensory and emotional reality remains powerful. Le Min, who survived a B-52 strike near Hanoi in December 1972, described this persistence. First there is a pressure in your ears. Then the ground moves like an earthquake. Then the sound, a sound like nothing else in this world. 50 years have passed, but if I close my eyes, I can feel it still. Some experiences never leave you, no matter how much time passes. The technical dimensions of the B-52 campaign have also left lasting legacies in military doctrine and technology. The integration of electronic warfare, precision guidance, and stealth characteristics in modern aircraft owes much to lessons learned during operations over Vietnam. The concept of the electronic battlefield, with its emphasis on sensor integration, real-time intelligence, and precision strike capabilities, emerged partially from analysis of Vietnam air operations. Modern air campaign planning, with its emphasis on parallel attacks against critical nodes in enemy systems rather than gradual escalation, reflects lessons drawn from the perceived limitations of earlier Vietnam bombing campaigns. Perhaps the most significant military legacy was the revitalization of air power doctrine that occurred in the decades following Vietnam. The perceived vindication of strategic bombing during Linebacker II encouraged Air Force theorists to develop more sophisticated approaches to using air power to achieve specific political and military objectives. These concepts would later be applied in conflicts from the 1991 Gulf War to the 2003 Iraq invasion, where precision air power was employed as a central rather than supporting element of campaign design. For the Vietnamese, the successful defense against B-52 operations became an important component of national identity, a demonstration of their ability to resist even the most technologically advanced adversary through determination, ingenuity, and collective sacrifice. Museums throughout Vietnam highlight the air defense effort, presenting artifacts from downed aircraft alongside narratives emphasizing popular participation in civil defense and anti-aircraft operations. This framing presents the air war not primarily as a technological contest, but as a demonstration of Vietnamese resilience and communal solidarity. The historical significance of the B-52 campaign extends beyond its immediate military context. It represented a particular moment in the evolution of modern warfare, like a point where industrial-era mass and technological sophistication confronted the resilience of a society mobilized for protracted resistance. The campaign demonstrated both the awesome destructive potential of modern air power and its limitations in resolving conflicts deeply rooted in political, social, and historical forces. This tension between technological capability and strategic effectiveness continues to shape military thought and operations in the 21st century. As a historical case study, the B-52 campaign offers important insights into the relationship between military means and political ends. The massive application of air power, while tactically effective in destroying targets and disrupting North Vietnamese operations, did not fundamentally alter the strategic balance or significantly change the terms of the eventual peace agreement. This outcome suggests the importance of aligning military operations with achievable political objectives and understanding the limitations of even the most sophisticated military technology in resolving complex conflicts. For individual participants and survivors, however, the significance of the campaign transcends these strategic analyses. It represents a defining life experience that shaped their understanding of themselves and their world. The profound human dimensions of the bombing, courage and fear, duty and doubt, survival and loss, remain its most enduring legacy. These personal narratives, whether from American air crews or Vietnamese survivors, remind us that behind the strategic calculations and technical specifications of warfare lie individual human experiences of extraordinary intensity. As time distances us from the events themselves, the B-52 campaign increasingly belongs to history rather than memory. Yet its lessons remain relevant for understanding both the capabilities and limitations of military power, the resilience of societies under attack, and the complex relationship between technological superiority and strategic success. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that warfare, regardless of the altitude from which it is conducted or the sophistication of the weapons employed, ultimately connects human beings in a relationship of profound consequence, one that continues to shape lives and societies long after the bombs have stopped falling.